So when it comes to sustainability, what do we need to change? How do we change the dialogue?
It is a very big challenge. The ways people get pleasure in authorship of doing buildings, of conceiving cities, has to change, both aesthetically and ethically.
We're building the equivalent of New York City every month in the world.
And now we have to find a new language of architecture that absorbs and simulates the problems that we are now facing. And of course, addresses also the health issues in our cities.
It's almost like we have to redefine our relationship between humanity and humans and the structures we interact with. From Round Glass, this is Living with Sunny. I'm your host, Sunny Singh. I'm here with my friend Thomas Power. Today we have a very interesting guest, Dr. Pedro Gadanho. Dr. Pedro is a global architect, and he's been having a fascinating discourse and innovation and creative ideas around sustainability, all these buildings and structure that exist around us, be it our home, be it an office or the public structures. So how do these structures and buildings and sustainability and climate change all come together? Welcome, Pedro. In one of your interviews, I heard that you love science fiction because if you look at architecture in the current world and science fiction, which gives you a peek in the future, how do you see the world of architecture evolving in the future, given the state of architecture in the current world?
Architecture as a field, both an artistic and technical field, has to have its moment of climax change. What makes it tick has to change. The ways people get pleasure in authorship of doing buildings, of conceiving cities, has to change, both aesthetically and ethically, so as to integrate the responses to these problems.
But Pedro, that almost, and you make a very good point, that almost requires creating an awareness. Now, people know about environmental crisis, people talk about sustainability, but there's a lot more talk than deep understanding of this space. And so we have to change the way we do our buildings. Our current building structures are not sustainable, whether they are breaking down, dilapidating, whether we're using sustainable materials, whether we use LEED certification. There's talk, there's some action, but the current way we are going is not sustainable, right? And the human interaction and engagement with the structures we live in, maybe the house we live in, the place we go to work in, or places we visit, right? Like a museum and all. It's almost like we have to redefine our relationship between humanity and humans and the structures we interact with so that it is on one way sustainable and on the other side, the art of it is preserved versus just saying, these are functional buildings for me. So when it comes to sustainability, what do we need to change?
Right.
How do we change the dialogue?
I think the change has to be almost philosophical, in the sense that we tend, as humans and as architects and urbanists, we tend to consider nature as separate from us. So we are building, and our built environment is different from natural environment. But there have been important ecologists defending that there is no nature, original nature anymore, that we have only second nature that has been touched by humans and changed by humans. And in that sense, if we start to understand our built environment as part of a larger ecosystem, we start conceiving buildings in a way that contributes to that ecosystem and not only extracts energy or extracts materials, it starts to give back. And this is the fundamental shift, considering that our built environment is part of a larger ecosystem and that the balance between built buildings and natural structures has to be achieved in new ways. So in that sense, I think we really must go beyond sustainability, because it's not about only building in a way that is sustainable, that we can keep going as far as possible. It really has to do with buildings that help regenerate their environments. So buildings that include green structures that can bring oxygen instead of dioxide carbon, that along their lives produce more energy than the embodied energy that went into their construction, and so they will compensate those emissions, those initial emissions of being built, and they will keep giving back. And so there are architects already today, especially in the Nordic countries, in Norway, for instance, like Snøhetta, who are already defending not net zero buildings, but positive carbon buildings, in the sense that they will contribute more than the energy and the dioxide carbon they consumed in their initial parts.
Pedro, I watched the climate show on Netflix,
Right.
and the thing that really surprised me or confused me or foxed me was after the USA and China, the third biggest emitter, as you said, is the concrete, the glass, the steel, all the emissions from. And I was thinking, okay, so how do you cut that down? And you've mentioned green buildings. But the thing that really shocked me was when they said on the show that we're building the equivalent of New York City every month in the world. And I paused it, rewound it back and said, and listened to it again. We're building the equivalent of New York City every month.
Especially in Asia. In Asia, yeah.
How is it possible to replace all that concrete, glass and steel with these sort of green buildings with trees growing out of them? How do we do that?
It is a very big challenge. And it has to be, as I said, has to be faced from very different angles. First of all, the concrete industry is trying to achieve ways in which they produce concrete which has not so much of those emissions. And this is difficult. There are alternatives to concrete being considered. Timber is coming back because it's sustainable and it can be produced again and again. So more and more timber structures are coming back onto the markets, and leading architects are showing that these are compatible with our ways of life.
In a way, what you're saying is that if you look at, you're saying on one side, 40% of the emissions are through all of these buildings and structures around us. And overhauling the buildings is a big task. We can't just overhaul all the buildings, and it seems like insurmountable as an endeavor. On the other side, you're seeing a lot of innovation happening and green shoots appearing in different places. So you're seeing there's a path to it, but it's a path that's going to take some time. So it's almost like we break down this big task into smaller tasks and saying, what are the little things we can do that have a multiplier effect a year or two or three from now? And that's how we're going to conquer this beast.
Exactly. And this is also how people can contribute, because people do get anxious about the idea that they are contributing or not, they're making their own effort or not. And I think it's more or less proven that although it's positive that people recycle and so on, I mean, the individual efforts are not that important in relation to changes that will come from policy making and from big companies adopting new ways of doing things. So I think although people have to be involved with their daily efforts, and that is always important, if people reduce their traveling, etc., which seems to be possible after COVID-19, we are all contributing with our little efforts. But of course, it's still at the level of government, at level of big agglomerates of companies and so on, places, universities where innovation is being produced. It's at that level that knowledge will have to accrue, experiments will have to come through.
And Pedro, listening to you, a thought that came to my mind was, today when it comes to electric vehicles, the government gives you a tax rebate in the US to do. And I'm thinking that two things. One is, what if the governments of one country after the other said, if you create sustainable structures that meets a certain criteria, we give you a tax rebate or a property tax rebate of certain kind, number one. And number two, one country after the other says we're going to give an annual building price for a building that's highly sustainable or the most sustainable created. Now, it's not those two things will change everything, but it draws down the dialogue. It actually concentrates the conversation on saying, and the awareness saying, this is important, let's recognize it, let's heat up the conversation, more people get involved. So it's almost like the governments have to step up in very two simple ways. Give a tax rebate on one side and say we're going to give a building price on the other side. And one government, one country after the other imitates this process.
Right. No, that's what I think most climate scientists are saying, and environmental economists. You will have to both give incentives and introduce, most probably, a carbon tax. And the carbon tax, I think, will be probably something that will work better than people expect, in the same sense that in face of inequality, millionaires are at this point saying, we want to pay more taxes. Because people will recognize that at a certain point, if things get so dire, it's better to pay and improve things than just to try and resist that sort of payment. And I do think that a carbon tax, there have been defenses on those grounds. I'm talking about well-being and global well-being. There are people who defend that carbon taxes globally should then be turned into an RBI, a sort of income, basic income, which is the same for everybody. Again, as the states did during COVID-19, of sending a check to people home. There are people who have made the mathematics and consider that a tax carbon would generate enough money to pay everybody a salary around the globe every month. And so this is incredible, but it's not so discussed. I mean, obviously it depends on the price that you're taxing carbon. But the fact is, if the problem becomes so big, then the tax on carbon will be higher, because you definitely have to incentivize people not to produce emissions. And the tax carbon will be effective on that respect. I know this is polemic in terms of economics, and there are defenders of one side or the other. But what I think is interesting is that sometimes these angles are not so explored in the debate. And I think that's pretty surprising. You have an economy driven by consumption. And this is the mind shift that also has to happen. It has to be driven by other factors and not by consumption, because we do have to reduce consumption. We have to have commodities that last for more time. We have to have better products that save us having to buy something new every year, because this is what's killing the planet. So we have to find an economic model that answers to that problem. And this is really part of the discussion we're having here, because resources, and we see the supply chain shortage right now, resources are not infinite, as people would like to think. And this means that we have to change that mindset of having consumption as the driver of our economies.
That's really, really good, Pedro.
And you almost are drawing, Pedro, a parallel between consumption, of course, architecture in terms of buildings and structures, and well-being of society.
Right.
You're saying this is all interrelated.
Yes, completely. And in fact, when it comes again to cities, of course, it is better to be in denser cities because they won't take so much land. So it is better to intensify the land use in cities. But it's also better to think more and more about what's called adaptive reuse. So really using existing structures, adapting them at lesser costs, at lesser environmental costs, instead of building new structures and just throwing away the garbage and so on. And of course, circular economy also comes into the picture by the fact that you will be able to tag technologically, you will be able to tag materials and have them tracked so that they can go back into the construction system and so on. So all of these things are also being discussed. And so renovation, rehabilitation is another essential feature when you're considering the built environment, and the way we have again to shift our climaxes. Because let's go back and think about the modernist period, when the architecture that we know today in our cities was driven both by a desire to improve the health in cities, with Le Corbusier defending that you should have streets and a city that would be healthier than the 19th century city, which was highly polluted and very with not so much sunlight and so on. And so there were these principles of health, but there was also a desire to use new technologies, new materials that were coming up that could change, of course, the language of architecture. And so people were really enthusiastic about the new materials like concrete and steel. And it took us 100 years to understand that maybe that was wrong, maybe that was problematic. And now we have to create a similar shift. So we have to find a new language of architecture that absorbs and simulates the problems that we are now facing, and of course addresses also the health issues in our cities.
So, one of the things we do, Pedro, in our conversations is we end it with a call to action. And what comes to my mind after listening to you in this conversation is that I would request every listener for today to look at their relationship with every structure they go into. Look at their relationship with their house. It's just not a matter of, I have a sitting area, I have a kitchen, and I have a bedroom, etc. I use them for these functions. But what is their relationship with their house? Because the house is an extension of them. If they go into an office, it's an extension of them. If they use a public structure, it's an extension of them and the society at large. And I want you to think about it. Any structure you go in today, think how your relationship with that structure is manifested. What thoughts come to your mind? And if that's an extension of you, you protect yourself. You take care of yourself. How about you take care of the extension of yourself? Think about it. Just think about it today. I want to draw attention to our users to Pedro's book, Climate Change. It's a fantastic topic, a really good book. I implore all of you to read it.
In these conversations, I've come to notice that although I want to speak about other matters, it always ends up that I'm so co-involved, convoluted by these changes and these problems that it's really something that I cannot resist. And I would have loved to speak about other topics, which I always also enjoy when thinking about cities and architecture. But at this moment, the urgency is so strong that in a way, one feels compelled to use every moment when there is a public forum to call attention to these issues and make people a little bit more aware of what they can actually do, both in their lives, yes, but also in their professional practices, because every professional area will have a contribution to give to this major shift that we are facing so that we can have a better life. Not only over our lifetimes, but for our grandchildren.
Well said.
Beautiful. Here.
Thank you.
Pedro, it's a delight to talk to you. I learned a few things today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Brilliant.
It was a pleasure.
Absolutely
well.
brilliant, Pedro.
And we'll keep talking, I hope.
Thank you for joining us on Living with Sunny. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. Thank you.